All right, y'all, we're back for another Meet Your Maker by Horror Joy. We're here with our maker today, Keith Rosson. I'm so excited about this. I read Fever House a while back and thought it was so much fun. Just the kind of punk rock of horror books, and it was really good. But today we're going to talk a lot about Coffin Moon, which I cannot wait for. But Keith, thank you so much for joining us today on Horror Joy.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This sounds like a fun, kind of unexplored topic that I haven't honestly thought a lot about. So nice.
Yeah, well, we'll start with the kind of premise of the show. You know, we are trying to find joy in horror, and there's lots of kind of ways to think about joy. But when you think about joy in horror, does that make sense for a lot of people? I don't know. It kind of doesn't make sense for them. But I think horror fans, this resonates, and I'm curious if it resonates with you and how it does so.
I think as a writer, I find a lot of joy, obviously, in the process. And right now I'm in the middle of drafting a new book, and it is really scary. And it's so like you're just bumping around in the dark, and you're like hoping to make plot connections and make these characters vaguely real and just all the fear that comes up with that, you know what I mean? And so for me, first drafts as a writer of horror novels is really just navigating through that fear. And it's in the second draft when everything is done and I'm able to start connecting, making all that connective tissue where as a writer the joy comes from. And like, oh, I think I'm going to bullshit my way through this one. You know what I mean? And I think as a reader of horror, and I read about 30% each of like horror, crime, and literary fiction. I find a lot of joy in obviously when a story is done well, but when something is touched on that has that universal feeling to it. You know what I mean? That like very common thing that the best fiction, regardless of genre, does, where it's just like, oh, I myself in this. You know what I mean? And I think that transcends like any crazy body horror shit you can come up with, is just that notion of connection.
So, Keith, I wonder if you might be willing to share with us like your origin story. How did you get into horror? How did you become an author? What's that path look like for you?
I immediately thought my origin story, I was bitten by a radio. Okay, so I started out in punk as like I couldn't play an instrument to save my life. And so I started making fanzines, and it was just a way of like being connected with the culture and got out in the 90s when I started out, man, you got all the free records if you did a fanzine. So it was my way of like, honestly, I was just in it for the CDs half the time. But I really started out with my writing chops doing these like kind of creative nonfiction fanzines. And they turned into like kind of things that I saw throughout my life. And I did like 25 issues of it throughout my 20s. And eventually that started to turn to short fiction. And when I was around maybe 30, I started short stories and submitting those, rejected and all that. And my first novel was my first published novel, and it came out on a called Meerkat Press, and they did the next four of my book. And then I had an agent who was, we just weren't quite, things just weren't quite working out. So I had a COVID quarantine, and my wife and I had just adopted a 2 and 3 year old who were like highly traumatized and like they'd been with us for like 3 weeks, and then COVID shut the state down. So they were like, who the hell are you? And why can't we leave? And so there's all that kind of like claustrophobia and intensity kind of smashed into that book. And I was a stay-at-home parent and I would write during their naps. And that book sold in like 6 days to Random House. And it's just been on since then.
That's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, so parenting during COVID was hard enough, but to be in that situation where you've got kids that are new to the environment, new to you, I'm sure you had been around them.
It was rough. I mean, it was very much a trial by fire for everybody, for all four of us, and we all had to really hustle and work our asses off. And those first couple years were pretty gnarly.
But I'm with you on. I wrote my dissertation. My kids were just about that age. They were, I think, maybe 2 and 3 at the time. I was waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was staying up past everybody else's bedtime, and wrote my dissertation that way. So understand those kind of fitting it in. I loved this book. So the idea that number one, Fever House has that punk rock stuff that makes so much sense of that early writing of yours. But Coffin Moon has this setting, and I don't want to take anything from Jeff. Jeff and I were talking a little bit before this, but I just read Angel Down by Daniel Kraus, and I think I've got War on the Mind. So my first, I guess, question about the book, if that's okay, is Nam shows up here, right? We've got a veteran who has come from Vietnam and fighting that war. Why start there? Why bring Nam into the story like that?
Yeah, so I did it for two reasons, and one is just the actual practical requirements of vampirism in Coffin Moon are like when you take a photo of them, their images are kind of altered, and it's like this kind of wafting smoke, where their faces and their hands and their bodies are. And given our prevalence of like surveillance technology and CCTV and just cameras everywhere, it just was such a hindrance, plot wise. And then secondly, I was born in the mid 70s, and all of the men in my life, the majority of them were veterans, and it was very prevalent in media in the 80s when I was, during my formative years. It was just kind of the war that I knew, in the sense that the adults in my life, it's what they had experienced. It felt more appropriate to kind of till that ground if I was going to do it than a more recent conflict where I don't really feel like that's a playground or my area to work in, given the prevalence of amazing, veteran writers who are writing about, more recent conflicts. So those two things are pretty much why.
That makes a lot of sense. We've been talking to a bunch of different creators, and vampires have been popular again, I guess we could say. We interviewed Stephen Graham Jones talking about Buffalo Hunter x Hunter. I guess you just did a fist bump or like a celebration about vampires, but I guess why vampires?
Yeah, so I mean, if you've read my books, my stuff is not terribly creative in the sense that there are not a lot of new, really. I take tropes and hopefully I spin them around a little bit and alter them in a way that's interesting and entertaining to read. But like Fever House is a zombie novel, Smoke City is a ghost novel, The Mercy of the Tide is a monster novel. And so my next one that's coming out in September is a witch novel. And so it was time, you know what I mean? And I wrote Coffin Moon like in 7 weeks. I was high off of Fever House. I thought I was very hot shit, and it was the biggest pile. And my editor was like, "Yeah, there's a story here, but this is not it." And so I had to go back, and maybe 10% of the first draft that I turned into my editor is actually what came out. So it's really just like I don't have my finger on the pulse of anything cool. I'm not like, I don't know of any trends or anything, but it was just the right time. And eventually I'm going to be running out of tropes and I'm going to have to, come up with something new. But as of now, I'm still just, running through all the standard ones.
I think what's so cool about the creative process is that it seems like all of the iterations continue to both tell the story and expand the story. And I think in many ways, what you're doing is doing that. For me, reading this book, it's like less about the vampire and more about the relationships. And I think that's a feat of artistic work where I am drawn in, not because it's a vampire, but because it's just a good story about people dealing with their shit and dealing with it together, dealing with it badly, and trying to figure out how that works. So there's that existential gap between what I am and what I want to be. And I think that's fully there.
Yeah, and I mean, that is like so much of where my writing lives is what you just mentioned. And my entire like goal, I think, as an author is not so much to come up with a fantastic, never before written story, but my job is to convince you, the reader, that these people are believable, you know, and that the way they interact with each other is at least, you know, passably believable. And if I can do that, I can introduce whatever idiotic, ridiculous thing is because the people are believable, you know? And that's what I struggle with very hard is like getting them to breathe on the page the best I can.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And seeing those relationships work that way in the novel is really neat. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you have the sections organized. I think this is really cool. The way you're foreshadowing at the different section starts, like what we're going to see happen in this. And I've seen a couple authors do this now. I'm thinking to Riley Sager's Middle of the Night, Brian,
I was gonna say it's something about the night. In the middle of the night? I
something
think
like
that's
that.
right.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess as an author, can you talk about some of these choices when you're doing organization of a novel like this? And like when you're telling a story, how you're compartmentalizing these things in your head as you're organizing?
Yeah, and I personally love that. There is some name for those, how each book section has like a chapter heading with like a little description of what happens. And I did that in The Mercy of the Tide as well, my first book. And I love it just as a device that gives you a little treat, you know what I mean? Like little kernels of what you're going to experience. And I think framing a book, man, it just happens like as the book reveals itself, then the framing device does too. But I have to put a lot of shit down first before it starts to make sense, you know? Like the one I'm working on now, I'm like, I still don't have it. I still don't know how it's going to be organized, you know? And I think that it just, I think people are very precious when they say, the characters speak to me. You know, I think that's a little goofy personally. They tell me what they want to do, and I'm powerless to stop it. But I do think there is something to be said about, like, I know a lot more at the end of a first draft about how the book is organized and sectioned out and all that. And it just kind of happens organically, you know, through trial and error and like just trying, just white knuckling your way through it, you know.
If this is too personal of a question, please let me know. We can move on. But there is a kind of an adoption that happens between the characters, right? An older man, middle, I mean, he's not that old, but he adopts his niece, basically. Did your experience adopting your children play a role in how that kind of relationship worked out?
I think every book, Crone that's coming out in September, Coffin Moon, both of the Fever House and The Devil by Name, since having kids, raising kids, every book in some way is about that shit, bone deep terror of being a shitty parent. You know, I think it's just I'm powerless to stop it. It's a big fear. Comes up a lot in Crone, the one that's coming out. And yeah, it's like parenting is such a defining force in my daily life that like it's totally creeps in there, you know. That's very much how I feel sometimes is I feel like Dwayne Miner in Coffin Moon where I'm just stumbling my way through and making every mistake possible, you know, and then getting up the next day and still having to move forward, you know.
So I'm curious with vampires and Coffin Moon. Are vampires always gay? Because we have John Varley and Johan in this case, and
I mean to his,
I'm
you
thinking
know,
back
to,
to
for
the
clarity's sake, he's bi.
okay. So yes,
Yeah, right. I don't know. I mean, what I tried to do with Coffin Moon is I really wanted to dismantle that notion of like a vampire that like lives in a castle and has a cloak and collects wealth and you know, it's like it is a harrowing, brutal existence where it's like if you and I stay up past our bedtime, we're tired the next day. You know what I mean? They die. And so and it's predicated on murder, right? Like so it's a brutal existence. And though that said, like transversely, you also live for a long time if you're willing to do these certain things, you know? And so you kind of really get to explore your preferences and what you like, you know, like sexually or whatever. And so part of it for me was I didn't want to have two male female groups battling each other. So it was almost like a logistical question, you know, where that just felt a little too corny to be like guy girl duking it out across the snowy countryside. So it was almost more notably that, you know. How's that for a non-answer?
But I think the pointing out that like the life of the vampire is brutal It is like it's not only brutal, but you live for so long that the labor of life just continues on and on and on. And you have to figure out how to do this shit over and over again.
You can't do a 9 to 5. You can't get a paycheck. You can't get housing. You know what I mean? It's challenging. So it's like looking at it from a logistical standpoint, it's like a royal pain in the ass, you know? And so you almost have to be like nomadic or always on the edge of like being discovered and living with that panic, you know?
Yeah, which I think taps into something that is going on in for sure the United States of people that are just living their lives and certainly worried about being picked up and taken away and not being able to live their lives. I think there's something about the anxiety of that right now that Coffin Moon kind of gets to.
Yeah, and that is certainly nothing that's really just an unfortunate, unintentional byproduct. You know what I mean? Of like, it was not written with all of the immigration bullshit in mind, you know? But yeah, I see where you're coming from with that.
I guess something that's a question that's maybe not about Coffin Moon in particular, but you said that you read about 30% quote unquote literary fiction in addition to crime and horror too. As a navel gazing elitist English professor myself, I'm just curious, as an author, as a consumer of literature, are these categories real? Where we like call literary fiction versus horror versus crime.
I mean, I think that there are touchstones in each that are notable enough. You know what I mean? Like, I think if I handed you, you know, Todd Goldberg's Gangsterland and tried to tell you it was a horror novel, you'd be like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" You know what I mean? But I don't think that like poo-pooing or gatekeeping genre is really worthwhile either, you know? And I mean, I like when I first started deciding in my early 20s like I'm going to be a writer, like I was reading a lot of like really kind of macho dude literary fiction, you know, like Daryl Spencer's Bring Your Legs with You that won the Drew Hines Prize in like 2001. Fucking love that book so much. And William Gay and stuff like that. It was like, you know, Southern Gothic or whatever, but still very tough and masculine and shit, you know? And I was like, oh, so you can write like tough bro fiction, you know, for better or worse, and still have it be like on a sentence structure, like beautiful, you know? And I'm reading, I just discovered him, a dude who I would have like just been bowled over by in my 20s, Tom Jones, you know, who wrote like all this like Vietnam and boxing shit, you know, which is just amazing stuff. So it was really that kind of masculine, broy literary stuff that made me want to be a writer and kind of opened my eyes to like what, you know, because I had just read Stephen King and Dean Koontz and Robert McCammon and all the like bigger names in horror, you know, and so then it was really like branching out into that literary stuff where I was like, oh, this is the type of shit I can do, you know.
I love that where like you're introduced to something and then you find out that in fact what you can do, what you want to do fits something else.
I mean, it's just like as it was like the same when I discovered like Basquiat, you know, as a teenager. I was like, oh fuck, you can paint like that if you want to, you know? It was just a galvanizing moment.
Yeah, when you find your home, that's incredible. I love hearing that kind of stuff. I actually, I'm sorry, but want to return back to the parenting part of it because the mythology of your story also has, these kind of, I don't know, hierarchy of vampires, right? But any vampire requires somebody that has to turn them into a vampire. Is vampirism a kind of broken parental lineage? Right? Is this another iteration of a bad parent or an image of a bad parent?
I mean, in Coffin Moon, Julia, her entire family, like she has just been, you know, screwed over from day one and is very much looking for and briefly has connectivity to a father figure. You know what I mean? In Dwayne Minor. And then halfway through the book, when they become kind of ensconced in this vengeance trip, he is just kind of useless. You know what I mean? And his entire goal is to just exist and make sure she exists. And he's just kind of going along to get along, and he's become this kind of weakened parental figure, and she's really the one who's the onus is on her, and she's the one moving them forward. And John Varley, his own father kicks him out when he's a teenager, and so he has this hope and this kind of like built up, you know, beautiful silver clouds image of the maker who turned him into a vampire, and then they finally meet again, you know, after 90 years or 100 years or whatever, and it's a really shitty reunion, you know. And so again, it's just that kind of like the notion of indebtedness is just shot through with the book, you know. And whether that's good or bad, that notion of parental indebtedness is like, I have no idea. I don't want to say. It's just that's one of the threads that are in there, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm gonna turn from Coffin Moon if that's okay. I've been recently interested in this idea that people post like prompts online. They're like, "Oh, what I really need is this kind of story." So my younger brother just sent me this one where he was like, "All right, look at this," and it's like, "Okay, if vampires don't need to breathe underwater, or if they don't need to breathe air, then they could live underwater, and they could actually have a whole commune on the bottom of the ocean." I'm not asking you to write that. Oh, I mean, I would love that. I would definitely read that. Have you read anything online where people are like, "I need this story," and thought, you know what? That's a really good idea. I'm just going to go ahead and take that up.
Yeah, no, but I mean, like my book, Road 7, that entire thing started from a prompt in my writing group, like 10 years back. You know what I mean? And it was like we would do this thing where we would write a person, a conflict, and a setting, and we would each draw, you know, and then you had to put two out of three of those into a short story. And I think mine was like a unicorn and sex in a pumpkin patch were the two that I used. And it I started out as a short story, and it had legs, you know what I mean? So it became a book. So coming up with ideas is really actually pretty hard for me. And I have a computer full of like half finished stories where I just kind of lose the thread, you know. But that said, I would also feel kind of janky if I stole it from someone else's prompt. So I kind of feel like a responsibility to pull shit out of my own head, you know.
No, that makes total sense. And of course, right, if you see something, I just imagine you'd having to give credit for it and all that kind of stuff. And that's, there's a weird process that would happen there.
Yeah, and with big publishers like Random House, they're like real careful about shit like that. You know what I mean? So it's kind of better. It's why I don't put like dedications or quotes in at the beginning because it's just like you have to like it's such a legal issue and you got to do all this paperwork for it and stuff and it's just like I'm just gonna pull it out here, you know?
And that makes sense. And we're thankful that you're doing that because the stories you're giving us are awesome. I want to ask you if you are reading anything, watching anything, playing anything, if you like to play games, video games, board games, any kind of games that is in the general genre of horror that is, I don't know, giving you joy.
The bummer about it is that so much of my reading life is taken up with blurbs, and so it's like stuff that's not out yet. You know what I mean? But again, I'm reading a lot of Tom Jones, and a guy that I always come back to is a buddy of mine, Gordon B. White, who writes very resoundingly weird short stories, and he has two collections out. And he's been in a ton of anthologies and best of horror and all that. He's done a couple novellas, and I just think there's one about like God has died, and these dudes are like driving an ATV through his hair. You know, it's just insane, beautifully written shit like that. You know, so when I struggle coming up with a horror thing like I am now, because I'm blurbing things that aren't going to be out yet for another 6 months or a year or whatever. It's like he is such a good bet for weird, creepy ass fiction.
I love it. Gordon B. White, I've got a tab open. I'm going to follow up that very soon. So that's an awesome recommendation. Anything else out there that's causing you joy, horror or not?
I don't know, man. I'm under the gun deadline wise with my book. And so things are kind of tight right now. You know what I mean? But my kids' birthdays are coming up soon. And so I'm very excited for them because they like flip out around that time. So that's going to be a good time for them.
The kids on their birthday. That's incredible. Yeah, so Fever House has a sequel. Is there any chance that we are going to get the same universe in Coffin Moon anytime?
You know, I can say that the Crooked Wheel that's mentioned in Coffin Moon, it is set entirely in current times. Crone is the new one that's coming out in September, and revolves around the Portland, or I'm sorry, the Coast chapter of that biker gang. In that way, it's a continuation, kind of a shared universe sort of thing.
I love that. I love it when the universe expands. Even if we don't get to revisit the characters, we get to revisit the world. That's awesome. Keith, I want to thank you so much for being here with us, for taking the time to talk about Coffin Moon, to talk about horror, to talk about joy. This has been incredible. I cannot wait for the next one. This has been awesome. For everybody out there, remember, find joy, even in horror. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.